was asked by CRIF DNB to talk about the Philippine supply chain landscape and best practices in supplier risk management in the new normal. This is actually a big step forward in terms of where we are in supply chain management in the Philippines. But before going through the slides, allow me to introduce first PISM. We are your professional organization of supply management professionals in the Philippines. So basically, we are professionals responsible in each of our organizations' purchasing, demand and replenishment, logistics, and customer service operations. If I will look at the chain itself, the pillars or the bigger groups in supply management, from demand and supply planning, to procurement, to manufacturing, to import-export, to logistics, up to delivery to customer and order and cash management. So basically, your PISM is the organization of all the people, all the professionals that are in these groups. Again, PISM is committed to uplift the supply chain profession. We are an organization of various multinational, local, large, and soon to be. We will now include medium, small, and micro enterprises in the Philippines. As part of our vision to uplift the supply chain profession in the Philippines, we are offering trainings under the new normal, which is via Zoom. So if you wish to get more of to learn more about our offerings, please reach out to PISM. We are available in Facebook. We are reachable through our website, and of course through other social media platform. Balikan muna natin how risks are being perceived prior to pandemic. I think everyone will agree na the 2020 pandemic changed the way we do supply management. Particularly this chart from Supply Chain Insights is very interesting, the way supply managers perceive risk before the pandemic. If you will notice, none were actually related to a global pandemic. Most of supply chain practitioners focused on cyber attacks, port congestion or port slowdown, and hurricanes and typhoons to include in that list. So most of us in the supply chain profession were actually gearing or preparing for disruptions related to cyber attacks, related to port congestion, related to natural disasters. None of us were actually prepared to another global pandemic. Well, to begin with, the last global pandemic happened 100 years ago. And to be fair, allow me to quote the president of Ford Motors in an interview in a cable news television show way back in March 2020. He said, "We are not prepared for a pandemic. We are not prepared for a lockdown." Imagine a multinational company, a global company, admitting that they have no BCP or a business contingency plan for a global pandemic. And I think from a risk standpoint, it's important now that we come up with a 360 risk assessment towards our business, our operations, our supply chain, to ensure that there is an uninterrupted supply. So again, none or very few organizations were able to prepare for a global pandemic. The global pandemic of 2020 is guaranteed to change the way we do supply chain in the Philippines and globally. It's very clear that there are some global phenomena that change the way we do supply chain. Let's go as far as World War II and during the Cold War. Basically, during this period, it modernized supply chain. It introduced the use of pallets, the use of crates, the use of drums. It introduced mechanization in the supply chain because of World War. And that changed the way we do supply chain. Similarly, in the 80s, in the 90s, where we had this Gulf Wars for 2 decades of war in the Middle East, it changed the way we do transport. It basically made oil as a prime commodity and as a very important factor in transport cost. It's actually one of the determinants of transport cost, not only in the Philippines but globally. Let's fast forward to the 2010s. We have seen enormous number of maritime disasters. It came to a point that in 2017, IMO released a SOLAS VGM policy implementing a mandatory weighing of containers. So imagine all shipping containers moving globally has to be weighed, has to be mandatorily weighed to ensure that shippers globally are declaring the correct weight of each container to avoid maritime disasters, which happened in the last 10 years probably. And of course, who would not forget the series of cyber attacks that happened to many global and local organizations. If you are in shipping, if you are in import-export, I know you have that story when the biggest shipping company globally were attacked and the system actually went down for a few days. That forced all shippers to put on hold their containers. Importers were forced to wait until the system were up and incurring demurrage and storage charges. And that happened, I think, 4 or 5 years ago. These are all defining moments in supply chain. It changed the way we behave today because the cyber attacks in the 2010s actually mandated all global and Philippine businesses to come up with cybersecurity measures, including automation of some key processes and putting parallel systems to ensure that the supply chain will be uninterrupted. Again, these scenarios are just proof that the 2020 pandemic will be very similar to them. It will change the way we behave, the way we do business in supply chain. So my next slide will actually focus on how this pandemic particularly impacted supply chain. When we look at materials planning, obviously, all of us in the supply chain suffered heavily in terms of shortages. When the lockdown was imposed in February, many of us are importing or sourcing from China. It was actually China who first implemented a hard lockdown. And imagine if you are heavily sourcing from China, your production facilities in the Philippines could have been put on hold or stopped operations for a while because of the lack of materials. Apparently, we've seen many factories and supply chain facilities in the Philippines who stopped operations because of labor-related concerns. Imagine even food processors or manufacturers of food needs to follow a certain health or quarantine protocols for all our manufacturers, for all our manpowers inside the facility. And it changed the way we manufacture. It changed the way we produce. Of course, since traveling is not allowed, sourcing changed to local instead of sourcing from abroad or sourcing from far-flung places, far from your current facilities. It changed. It changed the way we source materials and source new vendors. Of course, logistics were heavily impacted. We've seen how borders were actually put all over the Philippines. I remember when I was still in logistics at the time of the lockdown, many trucks were not even allowed to pass through ports, local ports in the Philippines because of the health restrictions. There are varying local policies that prevented our truckers to travel from one province to another, from one island to another, from one city to another. It changed the way we transport goods. It changed the way we distribute goods in the Philippines. And obviously, our consumers as well changed their behaviors. We used to be a mall-centric families, should I say. Filipinos loves to go to the malls, shop, and consume, probably. But during the pandemic, we were barred from visiting these retail outlets, this retail establishment. And consumer behavior changed from going to the malls to shopping online. And I think my colleagues in the supply chain profession will agree that online shopping portals are now the one benefiting from this pandemic. And I think every one of us in this particular WebEx session is that enjoying shopping from the comforts of our mobile phones. We're waiting for the 1122334455 and up till 1212 because of the online sales. And that's the way the pandemic changed our behavior. So guaranteed that supply chain will also adjust. We've seen how supply chain organizations behave since last year. From PISM, we noticed that everyone in the supply chain profession are actually actively reviewing risk 360 in the supply chain. We've seen our members working closely with their suppliers, looking at what other risks this pandemic will impose to them. We have seen members actively coordinating with authorities. At the end of the day, our government is imposing varying policies every 2 weeks. So we need to adjust our supply chain policies as well. It's good to know that there is now an effort from all supply chain organizations reaching out to government and reviewing risks, which is not actually a norm prior to pandemic. Also, in the midterm actions, we've seen our members preparing heavily on the reopening. Although reopening is very slow, or we can say that we already started the reopening period. But at the end of the day, these supply chain organizations keep on improving and changing the policies, the SOPs, the way we will serve our customers until such time that we welcome the new normal or the better normal, whatever we call it. We've seen members of the supply chain preparing for the next pandemic, the next global phenomena, the next potential lockdown, the next potential stoppage of shipping, the next potential lockdowns or quarantine protocols. We've seen members changing their strategies in such a way that it will be responsive to the new normal. We've seen how they put up satellite offices, warehouses, logistics facilities all over the Philippines. Later, I will show to you what is happening in the Philippines. So, as we enter 2021, we can say that we are starting to be in the new normal. But let's try to look at what changes or what are the new things that the 2020 pandemic introduced to us in supply chain in the Philippines. Number one is they introduced, or should I say, the pandemic forced Philippine supply chain organizations to go local, to embrace local sourcing, to decentralize distribution, and to put up logistics hubs, warehouses, transport hubs all over the Philippines because they don't want to feel and to be impacted again by another lockdown, by another complications in terms of transport. They don't want to suffer again from huge sales loss due to out of stocks because of transport burden, transport restrictions. So we've seen members actually putting up offices, warehouses, sourcing locally, sourcing from different regions, putting up distribution centers in almost all regions or all provinces in the Philippines. Another thing that will surely change the way supply chain management in the Philippines behave is the introduction of mandatory PPEs and health policies across the chain. This is very visible from retail to manufacturing to transport to even commercial offices, and even in the public areas. So I guess supply chain will really change in terms of the introduction of uh, protective health equipments and the health policies in the network. I think from the retail industry, we have seen retailers requiring even truck drivers and helpers to present health certificates, to present swab test, PCR test before they can get into the delivery facilities or to the receiving facilities of our retailers. We've seen that. Also, the pandemic has emphasized the need to collaborate with our logistics partners. Obviously, during the lockdown, it is our logistics partners who can move around. They were given the IATF pass. Their truckers, their trucks are allowed to roam around the Philippines. And we've seen the importance of our logistics partners. And I think what will change is that moving forward, there will be more of a collaborative partnership between the principal and the logistics partners. Also, one thing that will surely change after the pandemic is the transport rate and service flexibility. Many rates prior to the pandemic were actually in a lock-in rate or a fixed rate. But surely what will change is that moving forward, it will now have clauses or flexibility towards being responsive to government mandates. For example, we've seen local regulations imposing the presentation of health certificates or registration of truckers, drivers, and the truck company itself to the local authorities. So this will change because the new policies, not only by the government, but also retailers, customers, suppliers are changing. So that will be the new picture of supply chain in the Philippines in the new normal. Before I end, allow me to zoom in to risk management. What I will present to you is a hybrid, high-level kind of procurement programs that will surely change risk management with our suppliers. Basically, it will focus on game-changing procurement programs that will eliminate or lessen the risks in the supply chain. I'm talking here of supplier diversity and supplier outreach, the net zero programs, procurement sustainability, and risk management. This is all about supplier diversity program. This is a hybrid type of risk management wherein we don't consolidate our supply or our business with the big companies, with the multinational companies, with the majority or the key players in the industry. This is actually an initiative that started in the West, particularly in Europe, Canada, and the US. They introduced supplier diversity to distribute the eggs. As the saying goes, don't put your eggs in one basket. So there's now a trend in risk management not to give the entire business to one provider only. This is through diversifying your suppliers by giving opportunity to suppliers that are minority or ethnic owned businesses, woman owned by MSMEs or micro, small, and medium enterprises, LGBTQ plus owned businesses, and PWD owns. If I will try to look or zoom into the Philippines, there's no such regulation yet. There's no such policy yet, or even guidelines how to define what a PWD-owned company is, what a woman-owned company is. But if I will benchmark that to our counterparts in the West, particularly in the US and Canada, their definition of PWD-owned business is at least 51% of the business is owned by a PWD, things like that. These diversification programs enables the company to lessen risks by allowing an all-inclusive and open setup for supplier diversification. Also, in lessening or reducing risk is the net zero program. Basically, this focuses on environment and protection of natural habitat and localities where we operate. And I would assume every one of us ay meron ng kanya-kanyang mga environment programs sa ating respective companies. Of course, that includes sustainability programs in procurement, ensuring our operations and supply sustainability 3, 4, 5, 10, 15 years. Okay, here comes the risk management part. Very important in long-term and sustainability and risk management of a supply chain. Before letting, or I know all procurement professionals in the call or in the WebEx would agree with me that it's very important and it's empirical that we only transact with legit businesses, that we only deal with businesses that can sustain relationship with us, that can provide supply, that can provide service. So it's important that we check them. We know them better. We know them deeper than what's presented in PowerPoints or exhibits. We need to know them by heart. We need to know them by the books, by the records. And this is where the likes of our partners like CRIF DNB comes into play. Providing this important information on how this particular partner or vendor can support us. For example, profiling, getting into the regulatory records, compliance check, registration with internal revenue authorities here and abroad, securing and checking permits and licenses and registrations, the likes of SEC, the likes of FDA, the likes of BIR, for example. So these are very critical before we even transact with them. But the hybrid version or the 2021 version is actually on the next slide, which is a deeper and a more personal type of risk management. Okay, so this is actually a program which I picked up from one of the supply chain sessions I attended from abroad. It's supplier outreach. It's a more personal approach in getting or knowing your supplier. This is actually a win-win solution or a collaborative effort to know better to a personal level your supplier. It is done through different strategies of supplier outreach programs. We do this by conducting technical and managerial assistance to and from that supplier, because that's the only way you could check if they are really very knowledgeable on what they're doing, on what they are selling. Also, we do a category opportunity review. This is probably a forecast of supply or even prices in the next 3, 4, 5, 10 years. We do that jointly with them. Some others call it joint operations planning, joint business planning, or joint financial planning. By doing that, nakikilala natin yung partner deeper. Kasi during those conversations, malalaman mo kung may alam talaga ang isang supplier. Malalaman mo if they really know well the business. Also, we ask them to conduct coaching programs because through coaching programs, even us, the customers, even us, the supply chain organizations, we will learn from them, assuming they're really the expert. If they're really the expert, then they could really coach us. Of course, part of the reach out or the outreach program, is yung pagkakaroon ng recurring joint scorecard reviews. Of course, that includes joint business planning and joint operations planning. Through those efforts, nakikilala natin better ang isang supplier. Also, in 2020, 2021, we learned about face-to-face and virtual conferences. We work with customers, we work with suppliers, we know them better. And supplier summits and roadshows. Through the roadshows, we allow our vendors, we allow potential vendors to present to us their capabilities, case studies, and proven solutions that probably they have offered already to other customers. Sa pamamagitan po ng mga initiatives na to na medyo personal compared to yung old way of checking documents, nakikita natin how expert a potential vendor is, and how they could really help us moving forward as a partner of our business. Masyado ko na pong hinabaan ang aking presentation, but thank you, Sir Arden, for inviting me. I think this is my last slide.
That was very, very informative, Sir CJ, and we expect nothing more from supply chain professionals such as yourself, and also as someone from PISM. So thank you very much for the insights that you've shared.